In the blood-soaked annals of Westeros, where dragons danced and kingdoms burned, one name rises above all others in legend and infamy: Daemon Targaryen, the Rogue Prince. A man who wore a crown he conquered himself, who turned the streets of King's Landing into his personal domain of gold and steel, who loved his niece with a passion that scandalized the realm. They called him the most dangerous man in the Seven Kingdoms, and for good reason. Picture a prince who commanded the city watch with an iron fist, whose brutality became legend, a warrior who spent 3 blood-soaked years in the Stepstones, fighting pirates and feeding his enemies to crabs, a man who stood accused of murdering his own wife in a hunting accident that was anything but accidental, an uncle who seduced his 15-year-old niece through the shadowed alleys of Flea Bottom, teaching her secrets no princess should know. But here's what history struggles to answer. Was Daemon Targaryen a hero or a monster? The devoted brother who surrendered a crown out of love, or the ruthless kinslayer who orchestrated the murder of a 6-year-old child in his own bed? The grieving father who wept for his lost son, or the cold strategist who whispered a son for a son and unleashed hell upon an innocent family? And in the end, high above the cursed waters of the God's Eye, locked in mortal combat with his own nephew, both astride the greatest dragons the world had ever seen, what drove him to leap from his saddle, sword in hand, ready to kill or die in a moment that would echo through history forever? Hey guys, tonight we dive deep into the ruthless, complicated, and absolutely fascinating story of Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince who defied everyone. A man born of fire and blood, who lived by the sword and died as only a dragon rider could. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in the year 81 after Aegon's conquest, in the towering halls of the Red Keep, where the greatest dynasty the world has ever known rules over the 7 kingdoms. House Targaryen, the blood of old Valyria. Dragon lords who conquered Westeros on the backs of fire-breathing beasts and forged a realm from chaos. In this age, dragons still fill the skies above King's Landing. The dragon pit houses dozens of the magnificent creatures. The Targaryen bloodline runs pure and strong silver-haired princes and princesses with violet eyes that mark them as different, as special, as closer to gods than men. Into this world of ancient power and deadly politics, a second son is born to Prince Balon Targaryen and his sister wife Alyssa. They name him Daemon, a fitting name for a boy who would become both savior and destroyer, hero and villain, depending on who tells the tale. Daemon grows up in the shadow of his older brother Viserys, born 4 years earlier in 77 AC. While Viserys is measured, diplomatic, inclined toward peace and compromise, young Daemon is fire itself, restless, ambitious, hungering for glory that he believes is his birthright. He trains with sword and lance from the moment he can hold them. He learns to ride horses before most children can walk steadily, and most importantly, he bonds with a dragon. Caraxes, the bloodworm, a serpentine red dragon, lean and vicious, with a curved neck and a temperament that mirrors his rider perfectly. Battle, hungry, aggressive, loyal unto death. Where other dragons are massive and ponderous, Caraxes is swift and deadly, a creature built for war. The bond between Daemon and Caraxes becomes legendary. They are 2 halves of the same weapon. The brothers grow up together in relative peace, sons of the heir to the Iron Throne. Their father, Prince Balon, is a warrior and a leader, respected throughout the realm. Their grandfather, old King Jaehaerys I, the conciliator, rules wisely and well. The realm prospers, dragons soar. House Targaryen seems eternal and unshakable. But in 97 AC, when Daemon is 16, his brother Viserys marries Aemma Arryn of the Vale, a political match meant to bind the kingdom closer. And later that same year, Aemma gives birth to a daughter, Rhaenyra, a silver-haired princess who would one day become the center of the greatest civil war Westeros had ever seen. The baby niece who would, in time, become Daemon's greatest obsession, his wife, his queen. Then, in 103 AC, everything changes. Prince Balon dies suddenly, plunging the succession into uncertainty. Old King Jaehaerys, grief-stricken and aging, must choose a new heir. He passes over Rhaenys, daughter of his eldest son, in favor of Viserys, the male line, the safe choice. And so Viserys, at 26 years old, ascends the Iron Throne as King Viserys I. And his younger brother Daemon, just 22, bold and hungry and ambitious beyond measure, becomes the heir presumptive to the throne, second in line to rule the Seven Kingdoms. Unless, of course, King Viserys produces a son. Power has a way of revealing who a man truly is, and for Daemon Targaryen, power came early and came absolute. In 102 AC, his brother King Viserys appointed him commander of the City Watch, the force responsible for keeping order in the chaotic sprawl of King's Landing. It was a position of authority, certainly, but one that many nobles considered beneath a prince of the blood. The City Watch was underfunded, disorganized, corrupt to its core. The streets of the capital were dangerous after dark. Murder, robbery, and worse happened nightly, while the so-called guardsmen looked the other way or participated themselves. Daemon saw opportunity where others saw disgrace. He threw himself into the role with characteristic intensity, transforming the City Watch from a joke into something formidable. His first act was to fund the organization properly, using his own wealth and strong-arming contributions from merchants who had long benefited from lax enforcement. Then came the uniforms. He equipped every man with golden cloaks, distinctive and visible, so that citizens would know protection when they saw it, and criminals would know to fear it. The gold cloaks, the name stuck immediately. But it was his methods that truly defined his tenure, and here the legends diverge depending on who tells the story. To the small folk of King's Landing, Daemon became a hero. He walked the streets himself, unafraid, often at night when danger was highest. He ate in common taverns, drank in alehouses, warred openly on the street of silk. He knew the city not as a distant prince in a castle, but as someone who understood its rhythms, its darkness, its desperate heartbeat. Under his command, the gold cloaks cracked down on the worst offenders. Rapists and murderers faced swift justice. The streets became safer, at least in relative terms. To the nobility, however, Daemon's methods were barbaric and excessive. He wasn't interested in trials or the niceties of justice. Thieves lost hands. Ripers were gelded publicly. Murderers were hanged from the city walls as warnings. He ruled through fear as much as respect, and he made no apologies for it. The gold cloaks became his personal army, loyal to him above all others, even above the king. And that's where the trouble started. Because Daemon didn't just reform the City Watch, he made it his own. The gold cloaks answered to him, followed him, would die for him. This was dangerous. A prince with his own military force inside the capital, one that loved him more than they feared the throne. King Viserys noticed. More importantly, Otto Hightower noticed. Otto Hightower, the hand of the king, became Daemon's nemesis almost from the beginning. Where Daemon was impulsive and bold, Otto was calculating and patient. Where Daemon sought glory through action, Otto accumulated power through whispers and influence. He had convinced Viserys to appoint him hand instead of Daemon, a slight the prince never forgot or forgave. And Otto, for his part, saw Daemon exactly for what he was, dangerous, unpredictable, a threat to stability. The two men circled each other like wolves, both whispering in the king's ear, both vying for influence and control. Daemon's personal life during these years only added fuel to the fire. He was already married, technically, to Lady Rhea Royce of Rainstone in the Vale. They had wed back in 97 AC, a political match arranged when both were young. It had been a disaster from the start. Rhea was everything Daemon despised in a woman, or so he claimed. Masculine, plain, more comfortable with a sword than a gown. He called her the bronze bitch, a reference to the bronze armor the Royces wore, and made no secret of his contempt. They lived separately almost immediately after the wedding. She remained in the Vale ruling her lands. He remained in King's Landing doing whatever and whoever he pleased. And what pleased Daemon were the pleasures of the flesh, enjoyed frequently and publicly. He maintained a residence on the Street of Silk, the city's most notorious quarter. He had favorite brothels, favorite tavern brawls, a reputation that both scandalized and titillated the court. Nobles whispered about his excesses. Small folk loved him for being one of them, or at least pretending to be. In 104 AC came the tournament that would cement his reputation for brutality. It was held to celebrate some occasion or another, the details lost to history, but what happened there was not forgotten. Daemon participated in the lists, as princes were expected to do, but he fought with a savagery that went beyond sport. He unhorsed opponents with vicious precision. He continued beating men after they yielded. There were serious injuries, broken bones, at least one death that some claimed was deliberate. The nobility was horrified. King Viserys was embarrassed. Otto Hightower filed away another piece of evidence that Daemon was unsuitable for any real responsibility. But the crowds roared their approval. Here was a prince who fought like a true warrior, who didn't prettify violence or pretend combat was anything other than what it was. Bloody, brutal, real. Yet beneath the reputation for violence and excess, Daemon was genuinely capable. The City Watch functioned better than it ever had. Crime genuinely fell. The king's peace was kept mostly in ways it hadn't been for decades. Daemon proved himself an effective administrator when he chose to be, a natural leader who inspired loyalty. Men would follow him anywhere, and that should have been an asset to the crown. Instead, it became a liability. Because by 105 AC, the political situation in the Red Keep had shifted dramatically. Queen Aemma had given Viserys only one living child, the Princess Rhaenyra, now 8 years old. Every other pregnancy had ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The king needed a son. The realm expected a son. And as long as Viserys remained without a male heir, Daemon stood one life away from the Iron Throne. He was the heir presumptive, the next in line, and everyone knew it, including Daemon himself, including Otto Hightower, who watched the rogue prince command his gold cloaks and saw a future king who would destroy everything Otto had built. The tension couldn't last forever. Something had to break. It broke in the most tragic way imaginable. The year 105, after the conquest, brought death and scandal in equal measure, and Daemon Targaryen found himself at the center of both. Queen Aemma Arryn had been pregnant again, her 9th pregnancy in 11 years of marriage. The realm held its breath, hoping this time for a son. King Viserys needed an heir, a boy to secure the succession and quiet the whispers about Daemon's position. The Maesters believed this pregnancy was different. The queen carried the child well. Signs pointed toward a boy. But childbirth in this age was a battlefield where even queens could fall. When Aemma went into labor, something went terribly wrong. The baby was breech, turned the wrong way. The labor stretched from hours into a full day of agony. The Maesters presented King Viserys with an impossible choice. They could attempt to cut the baby from Amaya's womb, a procedure that would almost certainly kill her but might save the child. Or they could let nature take its course and likely lose them both. Viserys, desperate for a son, and believing the Maesters could save Aemma afterward, gave his consent. They cut her open while she was still conscious, still screaming. She died on the table. Her suffering finally ended. And the baby boy they pulled from her body, the son Viserys had sacrificed his wife to obtain, lived only a few hours before he too passed. They named him Lon, after Viserys' father. The king was destroyed. The realm mourned. A queen and a prince, both gone in a single day. And Daemon, once again, was heir to the Iron Throne. What happened next depends entirely on which version of events you believe, and the truth has been debated by historians for generations. According to Otto Hightower's account, Daemon received news of the deaths while he was on the Street of Silk, already deep in his cups at one of his favorite brothels. Instead of showing proper grief or respect, Daemon allegedly threw a celebration. He called for more wine, toasted his companions, and raised his cup with the words that would damn him to the air for a day. A cruel joke about the baby prince who had lived mere hours, a callous mockery of his brother's tragedy, a display of ambition so naked and vile that it could not be forgiven. Otto personally reported this to the king, complete with witnesses who swore they heard Daemon speak those exact words. Daemon's defenders, and he had some even then, told a different story. They claimed he never said it, that Otto fabricated or exaggerated the whole incident to drive a wedge between the brothers, that Daemon, whatever his faults, would never mock a dead infant or celebrate his brother's suffering, that Otto saw an opportunity to remove his rival from court and seized it with both hands. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in between. Daemon was drinking that night. That much is certain. He was surrounded by his gold cloaks and various companions of questionable character. Whether the exact phrase was spoken, whether it was meant as darkly as it sounded, whether Otto embellished what actually happened, we will never know for certain. What we do know is what came next. King Viserys, raw with grief and anger, summoned his brother to the Red Keep. The confrontation was private, but servants heard shouting. Viserys, normally so measured and patient, unleashed years of frustration at Daemon's behavior, the recklessness, the scandals, the ambition barely concealed beneath a veneer of brotherly loyalty. And now this obscene display at the very moment Viserys had lost everything. Daemon was banished from King's Landing, stripped of his position as commander of the City Watch, ordered to return to his wife in the Vale, and stay there. No timeline for return was given. It was exile, pure and simple, and the realm understood it as such. For Daemon, it must have felt like a kind of death. He had built something in the capital, forged the gold cloaks into his personal force, made himself indispensable to the functioning of the city. He had status, respect from those who mattered to him, access to power, and now he was being sent to Runstone, to live with a wife he despised in a region that had never felt like home. The journey to the Vale was long and bitter. He rode through the mountains of the moon knowing that behind him, Otto Hightower was consolidating power, whispering in Viserys' ear without opposition. The gold cloaks he had trained and commanded would be given to someone else. His place at court would be filled. He was being erased. Runstone itself was everything Daemon hated. Ancient, yes, and proud in its way, but provincial and dull. The Vale Lords were conservative, traditional, suspicious of outsiders, especially Targaryens, who brought their foreign customs and their dragons. Lady Rhea Royce ruled her lands competently, but she and Daemon could barely stand to be in the same room. She made her feelings clear enough. She had not asked for this marriage any more than he had. She ruled Runestone perfectly well without a husband. Thank you very much, and certainly didn't need Daemon interfering in her affairs. If he wanted to drink himself to death in the keep's hall, that was fine. If he wanted to fly off on Caraxes and disappear for weeks, even better, just stay out of her way. For Daemon, trapped in exile with a wife who despised him and nothing to occupy his restless energy, the months must have crawled by like years. He was 24 years old, in his prime, and he was withering away in the Vale while life continued without him in King's Landing. But Daemon Targaryen was never one to accept defeat quietly. His mind turned to possibilities, to schemes, to ways he might return to relevance and power. The Stepstones, those rocky islands between Westeros and Essos, had become a problem. Pirates from the free cities had taken control, calling themselves the Triarchy. They were disrupting trade, raiding ships, becoming a genuine threat to Westerosi interests. If Daemon could solve that problem, if he could win a war without his brother's help or permission, if he could prove himself indispensable through action rather than words, then perhaps exile wouldn't be permanent. He began reaching out to old allies, writing letters, making plans, and most importantly, he contacted Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, the wealthiest man in Westeros, and someone with his own grievances against the crown. Together they would start a war, and Daemon would transform himself from exiled prince to conquering hero. Or die trying. War came to the Stepstones not with declarations or banners, but with blood and fire and the screams of dying men. The islands themselves were barely worth fighting over, harsh volcanic rocks jutting from the narrow sea between Westeros and Essos. Strategically vital, certainly, controlling the major shipping lanes, but offering little else. No fertile soil, no great cities, just stone and salt spray and endless wind. Yet it was here that Daemon Targaryen chose to make his stand, to carve out glory from nothing, to prove his worth to a brother who had cast him aside. The enemy was the Triarchy, an alliance of 3 free cities, Myr, Lys, and Tyrosh. They had pooled resources to fund a fleet of pirates who now controlled the Stepstones, disrupting trade and demanding tribute from any ship that wanted safe passage. Their leader was a man named Krakus Draha, called the Crab Feeder, for reasons that would become horrifyingly clear. Lord Corlys Velaryon had his own reasons for wanting the Triarchy destroyed. His trading fleet, the largest in Westeros, was losing fortunes to piracy. His wife, Princess Rhaenys, had been passed over for the throne in favor of Viserys, a slight Corlys never forgot. Helping Daemon win a war would embarrass the king who had refused to fund a campaign himself. It was personal, political, and profitable, all at once. So in 106 AC, Daemon and Corlys launched their private war. No royal sanction, no crown funding, just 2 ambitious men, a fleet of ships, a dragon, and an army of sellswords and second sons looking for glory or gold. The early months were chaos. The Triarchy had transformed the Stepstones into a nightmare of defensive positions. Every island was fortified, every beach was trapped, every cave system became a hiding place for ambush. And Kragus Draha himself was a tactical genius, compensating for his lack of dragons with cunning and cruelty. His signature tactic was psychological as much as military. When he captured Westerosi sailors or soldiers, he didn't simply execute them. He staked them out on beaches at low tide, buried up to their necks in sand, and left them for the crabs. As the tide came in, the crabs came with it, drawn by blood and flesh. The screams carried for miles. The message was clear. This was not a gentleman's war with ransoms and mercy. This was extermination. Daemon responded with his own brand of brutality. Caraxes burned enemy ships in their harbors. Fortifications were reduced to ash. Captured pirates were hanged from the masts of their own vessels and left to rot as warnings. If Kragus wanted to wage war without rules, Daemon would match him horror for horror. But despite the dragon, despite Daemon's skill as a commander, The war ground into a stalemate. The Triarchy had too many islands, too many caves, too many reinforcements from the free cities. Every victory seemed to lead to another ambush, another setback. The sellswords began to grumble about payment. Some deserted. Daemon himself took wounds in several engagements, nothing life-threatening, but enough to show he was fighting in the thick of combat, not directing from safety. Corlys's gold was running low. The war that was supposed to be quick and glorious had become a meat grinder, consuming lives and resources with no end in sight. Back in King's Landing, Viserys watched his brother's campaign with mixed feelings. Pride, perhaps, that Daemon was proving his martial skill. Concern that the war was escalating. Irritation that Daemon had started this mess without permission. But he sent no help. By 108 AC, 2 years into the campaign, Daemon was desperate. He needed a decisive victory, something dramatic that would break the Triarchy's will and end the war. Rhaegar's Dryar had become a ghost hiding in caves, striking from ambush, refusing direct battle. The crab feeder understood that time was on his side. Eventually Daemon would run out of money or men or patience. So Daemon devised a plan as bold as it was insane. He would use himself as bait. He would appear vulnerable, wounded, without his dragon, tempting Kragas into the open for a killing blow. And when the Triarchy forces committed to the attack, Corlys' fleet would strike from the sea while Carxes descended from above. It was the kind of plan that required absolute trust in your allies and absolute confidence in yourself. It was also the kind of plan that could get you torn apart by enemies if anything went wrong. On the appointed day, Daemon walked alone onto a contested beach, carrying a white banner of parley. He had made sure rumors spread that he was wounded from the last engagement, that he wanted to negotiate an end to hostilities, that he was finally broken. Kragas, from his position in the caves, watched and calculated. It could be a trap. It almost certainly was a trap. But the chance to kill a Targaryen prince, to capture a dragon rider, to end this war in one stroke, that was too tempting to ignore. The Triarchy forces emerged like ants from a disturbed hill. Hundreds of them, armed and armored, surrounding the lone prince on the beach. Daemon stood his ground, waiting, one hand on his sword. Dark Sister, a Valyrian steel blade that had been in his family for generations. Rhaegar himself approached, armored head to toe, carrying a wicked curved blade. He said something, some taunt or demand for surrender. Daemon's response was lost to history, but what happened next was not. The white banner fell. Dark Sister sang from its sheath, and Daemon Targaryen went to war. He cut through the first rank of enemies before they even understood what was happening. Dark Sister cleaved through armor and bone like they were parchment. Daemon was a whirlwind of silver and steel, every movement precise, every strike lethal. He had trained for this his entire life. Combat wasn't something he did, it was what he was. But even Daemon Targaryen couldn't fight hundreds alone forever. The Triarchy forces regrouped, surrounded him, began to press in with spears and nets. For a moment it looked like the plan had failed, like Daemon's boldness had finally gotten him killed. Then Corlys's fleet appeared on the horizon, sails filling with wind. Rams pointed toward the Triarchy ships in the harbor, and above, blocking out the sun, came Carxes. The blood worm descended with a roar that shook the very stones of the Stepstones, and the world became fire. The battle that followed was slaughter. The Triarchy forces caught between dragon fire from above and Valyrian soldiers from the sea broke and ran. Those who made it to the caves found Daemon's forces already there, having landed under cover of the chaos. There was nowhere to go. No escape, no mercy. Daemon himself pursued Chryses Drahar into the cave systems, a hunt through darkness that ended in single combat. The details are fragmentary, passed down through soldiers who claimed to have witnessed it. blades clashing in torchlight, blood on stone, and finally, Daemon emerging from the caves dragging Chryses' corpse behind him. What he did next became legend. Daemon dragged the crab feeder's body to the same beaches where the man had fed his victims to the crabs. He staked the corpse out just as Kragas had done to so many others. Let the crabs have their master. With Kragas dead and their fleet destroyed, the Triarchy forces surrendered. The Stepstones belonged to Daemon. 3 years of brutal warfare had ended in total victory. And Daemon, never one for modesty, crowned himself. He found Kragas' driftwood crown, the makeshift symbol of authority the crab feeder had worn, and placed it on his own head. King of the Narrow Sea, King of the Stepstones, a title without legitimacy, without recognition, but a title nonetheless. When word reached King's Landing, Viserys was furious. Daemon had not only waged an unauthorized war, he had now declared himself a king. This was treason, or close enough to make no difference. The realm held its breath, wondering if brother would go to war against brother. But Daemon, for all his faults, understood the game. He returned to King's Landing not as a king but as a supplicant. In a public ceremony before the court, he knelt before Viserys and offered him the crown. The Stepstones, he said, belonged to the Iron Throne. He had conquered them in his brother's name. He claimed no kingship except what his brother might grant. It was theater, and everyone knew it. But it was brilliant theater. Viserys couldn't punish him without looking petty. The realm had a genuine hero, a prince who had won a war against impossible odds. The small folk loved him more than ever. Daemon was allowed back to court. His exile ended, and King Viserys, perhaps hoping to bind his troublesome brother closer, welcomed him home. It would prove to be a terrible mistake. Daemon returned to King's Landing in 110 AC as a conquering hero, but he found a court that had changed in his absence. The Red Keep he remembered, where he had commanded the gold cloaks and built his power base, was now someone else's domain. King Viserys had remarried. 4 years earlier, in 106 AC, barely a year after Queen Aemma's death, he had wed Alicent Hightower. Not a great strategic match with some powerful house, but the daughter of his own hand, Otto Hightower's daughter. The marriage had shocked many, pleased few, and accomplished exactly what Otto had intended. He had bound himself to the throne through blood, ensuring his family's position for generations. Alicent had already given Viserys what Aemma never could: sons. Prince Aegon was born in 107 AC, a healthy boy with the silver hair and purple eyes of his Targaryen blood. Then came Princess Helena in 109 AC, and Prince Aegon would follow in 110 AC, the very year of Daemon's return. The succession that had once seemed so clear with Daemon as heir presumptive was now muddied beyond recognition. Because Viserys had done something unprecedented after Aemma's death and before his remarriage. In 105 AC, he had named his daughter Rhaenyra as heir to the Iron Throne, not temporarily, not conditionally, but absolutely. The lords of the realm had bent the knee to her, sworn oaths to uphold her succession. She was Princess of Dragonstone, the formal title of the heir, and Viserys showed no signs of changing his mind even now that he had legitimate sons. This created a situation unlike anything Westeros had seen before. A named female heir with younger half-brothers who many believed had stronger claims simply by virtue of being male. The realm was divided before any war even began, split between those who honored their oaths to Rhaenyra and those who believed the traditional succession through the male line should prevail. Daemon watched all this unfold with the keen eye of someone who understood power and its movements. He had been gone for 4 years, fighting and bleeding in the Stepstones, and in that time the entire political landscape had shifted beneath his feet. He was no longer heir presumptive. He was no longer even particularly close to the throne, but his niece Rhaenyra, She was the key to everything now. Rhaenyra had been a child when Daemon left for exile and war. Now she was 13, on the cusp of womanhood. And unlike any Targaryen princess who had come before, she had her father's love and her own dragon Syrax, a golden beauty she had bonded with as a girl. More than that, she had inherited her father's kindness, but also something fiercer, something that reminded people uncomfortably of Daemon himself. She was fascinated by her uncle from the moment he returned. Here was the rogue prince, the man who had conquered the Stepstones, who wore battle scars like jewelry, who moved through the world taking what he wanted without apology. He was everything the court was not, dangerous where they were safe, honest about his appetites where they were hypocritical, bold where they were cautious. Daemon, for his part, recognized something in Rhaenyra as well. She was bored by courtly life, restless with the expectations placed upon her. She wanted to fly, to fight, to rule, not sit and smile and play the dutiful daughter. She asked him about the war, about combat, about dragon riding in battle. She listened to his stories with an intensity that flattered him and concerned others. Otto Hightower watched their growing closeness with alarm. He had successfully maneuvered his own daughter onto the throne and his grandsons into positions of succession. The last thing he needed was Daemon whispering in the heir's ear, turning her against the Hightowers, filling her head with dangerous ideas about power and how to use it. But for these few years, from 110 to 115 AC, there was a strange kind of peace at court. Viserys was healthy and happy with his new family. Rhaenyra was secure in her position as heir. Daemon seemed content to play the role of indulgent uncle and war hero. The realm prospered. Trade flourished now that the Stepstones were secure. Dragons flew over King's Landing, symbols of Targaryen power that seemed eternal and unshakable. Beneath the surface, though, tensions simmered. Alicent grew more protective of her children's positions with each passing year. She understood that as long as Rhaenyra was heir, her own sons were in danger. Either they would have to bend the knee to their older half-sister, accepting a subordinate position, or they would have to challenge her claim and risk everything. Daemon spent his time training, flying caraxes, frequenting the same establishments on the Street of Silk that had always welcomed him. He sat on the small council when it suited him, offered advice that was sometimes brilliant and sometimes calculated to cause chaos. He was still married to Rhea Royce technically, though they had not seen each other in years and had no intention of changing that. The court learned to accommodate him. This dangerous prince who had proven he could win wars and command loyalty, but who refused to fit into the neat boxes of noble behavior. He was valuable enough to tolerate, concerning enough to watch carefully, and connected enough to the heir that removing him would be nearly impossible. Rhaenyra, meanwhile, was coming of age in the center of this web of politics and power. She was being educated in statecraft, taught to rule, prepared for a throne that was her birthright, but which many believed she should never hold. And her uncle Daemon, perhaps alone among the court, treated her not as a child or a pawn, but as someone who might actually deserve the power she was promised. Looking back, these years were the calm before the storm. The pieces were all moving into position. Daemon, closer to Rhaenyra than was entirely proper. Otto, scheming to secure his family's future. Viserys, trying to believe that love and good intentions could overcome the fundamental contradiction he had created by naming his daughter heir and then producing sons. Alicent, growing more desperate to protect her children from a future she saw more clearly than her husband. Something had to break. Someone had to make a move that would shatter the fragile peace. In 115 AC, two events occurred that would set everything else in motion. Lady Rhea Royce died in a hunting accident in the Vale, and Daemon Targaryen, finally free of a marriage he had always despised, turned his full attention to the one person who had always fascinated him most. His niece, the heir to the Iron Throne. the girl who was no longer quite a girl. The official report stated that Lady Rhea Royce died from injuries sustained in a fall from her horse while hunting in the mountains near Runestone. She struck her head on a rock and lingered for 9 days before succumbing to her wounds, a tragic accident. These things happened, especially in the treacherous terrain of the Vale. Nobody believed it for a moment. Daemon had been seen in the Vale shortly before his wife's death, though he had not visited Runestone itself or made his presence widely known. He returned to King's Landing immediately after her death was confirmed, showing no grief whatsoever. When asked about it at court, he allegedly said she had simply fallen off her horse, as if this explanation should satisfy everyone. The Vale lords were furious but powerless. They could not prove Daemon had killed Rhea or arranged her death, only suspect it strongly. When Daemon tried to claim Runestone as her widower, they blocked him at every turn. The castle and its lands went to Rhea's cousin, a Royce of legitimate birth, who had far more support than a Targaryen prince who had treated their lady with contempt for nearly 20 years. Daemon gained nothing material from Rhea's death. No lands, no wealth, no additional power. What he gained was freedom. The marriage that had been a chain around his neck since he was 16 was finally broken. He was unmarried, available, and at 34 still considered quite desirable, despite his reputation. The question on everyone's mind was what he would do with that freedom. The answer came soon enough, and it scandalized the realm in ways even Daemon's previous behavior had not. In 116 AC, Daemon approached his niece Rhaenyra with a proposition. He would take her out into King's Landing, show her the real city beyond the Red Keep's walls, let her see the world as it actually existed, rather than the sanitized version presented to princesses. She was 19 now, old enough to make her own choices, and she agreed eagerly. What happened that night has been debated by historians and gossiped about by common folk for generations. The truth is likely more complicated and less dramatic than either version suggests, but here is what we know. Daemon disguised Rhaenyra in common clothes, a cap hiding her distinctive silver hair. They left the Red Keep through secret passages that Daemon knew well from his years commanding the City Watch. They walked through Flea Bottom, the poorest and roughest section of King's Landing, where Daemon was still recognized and respected despite his noble birth. They visited taverns where she drank ale with small folk. They watched street performers and listened to bawdy songs. And they went to the Street of Silk. Daemon brought his 19-year-old niece, the heir to the Iron Throne, into a brothel. Not to a private room, but into the main hall where patrons paid for their pleasures openly and without shame. Rhaenyra saw things no princess should see, experienced a world that was entirely foreign to her sheltered existence. Whether Daemon's intentions were to educate her or corrupt her or seduce her or some combination of all three, only he knew. What happened between them physically is unclear. Some accounts claim they kissed, touched, began something they did not finish. Others say Daemon stopped himself at the last moment, unable or unwilling to cross that final line with his niece. Still others insist nothing happened at all beyond showing her a world she had never known existed. What is certain is that they were seen, recognized despite their disguises. Word spread through the city with the speed that scandal always travels, reaching ears that were all too ready to believe the worst. Otto Hightower heard the rumors within hours. He dispatched spies to confirm details, gathered testimony from witnesses, and then did exactly what Daemon should have known he would do. He went to the king. King Viserys was presented with accounts of his brother taking his daughter, his heir, into a brothel on the Street of Silk. Otto's report was detailed and damning. He had witnesses. He had descriptions of what they had been seen doing, and he pointed out, quite reasonably, that Darium's intentions were obvious. He wanted to seduce Rhaenyra, marry her, and through her gain access to the throne he had been denied. Viserys was shattered. This was a betrayal beyond anything Daemon had done before. Not just scandal or political maneuvering, but a direct assault on Viserys' daughter, his chosen heir, the person he loved most in the world. That Daemon would corrupt her, would use her this way. It was unforgivable. Daemon was summoned to the throne room. The confrontation was not private this time. Courtiers witnessed a king's rage turned on his own brother. Viserys demanded to know what Daemon had been thinking, what he had intended. And Daemon, perhaps reading the room poorly, or perhaps simply being honest for once, made his proposal. He would marry Rhaenyra. It made perfect sense when you thought about it. They were both Targaryens, both dragon riders. Valyrian tradition had always favored keeping the bloodline pure. She needed a husband who was strong enough to help her hold the throne. He was that man. The marriage would secure the succession, unite potential rival factions, give the realm a clear path forward. Viserys refused absolutely. He saw through the reasoning to what he believed was the truth underneath. Daemon wanted power, as he always had. He wanted the throne, as he always had. And he was willing to use Viserys' own daughter to get it. The sentence was exile. Again, Daemon was banished from King's Landing, ordered to return to Dragonstone, and stay there. No timeline for return was given. This time felt more permanent, more final. Viserys had forgiven many things, but this he could not forgive. There was a twist, though, one that Daemon probably appreciated even through his anger at being exiled. Otto Hightower had overplayed his hand. His network of spies, his immediate knowledge of what had happened that night, his detailed report to the king, all of it revealed just how closely he was watching everyone. Viserys, who had tolerated Otto's scheming because of Alicent, finally saw his hand for what he truly was. A manipulator who put his family's interests above everything else. Otto Hightower was dismissed as Hand of the King, sent back to Old Town, removed from power. His influence at court ended. It was small consolation for Daemon, exiled once more, but it was something. His enemy had fallen even as he himself was cast out. Rhaenyra meanwhile faced her own consequences. Viserys, desperate to end the scandal and secure her reputation, quickly arranged her marriage to Lendor Valerian, Corlys's son. It was a good match politically, uniting the two most powerful Targaryen-aligned houses. The fact that Lendor preferred the company of men was known but politely ignored. They would do their duty, produce heirs, and maintain the appearance of a proper noble marriage. The wedding took place within months, rushed and overshadowed by scandal. Rhaenyra became Lady of Driftmark, wife to the heir of the wealthiest house in Westeros. She left King's Landing for Dragonstone, where she would build her own household, her own power base, away from her father's court and the Hightower's influence. And on Dragonstone, in the ancient seat of House Targaryen, she would have a neighbor, her uncle Daemon, exiled once more, alone with his dragon and his ambitions and his thoughts about the niece who had been forced to marry someone else. They were both trapped on the same island now, politically exiled, separated from the center of power. The question was not if they would grow closer, but when and what would happen when they finally did. Something unexpected happened to Daemon Targaryen in the years that followed his exile. Something that no one, least of all Daemon himself, could have predicted. He fell in love. In 117 AC, 2 years after being banished to Dragonstone, Daemon married Laena Velaryon. She was the daughter of Corlys the Sea Snake and Princess Rhaenys, the queen who never was. Targaryen blood ran strong in her veins. More importantly, she was a dragon rider, bonded to Vhagar, the oldest and largest dragon still living in the world. Vhagar had once belonged to Queen Visenya, one of Aegon the Conqueror's sister wives, and had fought in the original conquest of Westeros. The dragon was massive beyond comprehension, her wings capable of blotting out the sun, her roar loud enough to shake castle walls. That Lavinia had claimed such a beast spoke to her courage and worthiness. She was no delicate courtly flower, but a woman of fire and spirit. Their marriage was controversial, of course. Everything Daemon did was controversial. Laenor had once been offered to King Viserys as a potential bride when she was barely 12 years old, paraded before him by her ambitious parents, hoping to secure the ultimate political match. Viserys had chosen Alicent Hightower instead, and Laenor had grown up knowing she had been considered and rejected by the most powerful man in Westeros. Now at 22, she was marrying his brother. The irony was not lost on anyone. But unlike Daemon's first marriage to Rhea Royce, this union was born of genuine attraction and mutual respect. Laenor was adventurous, bold, comfortable with violence and conflict in ways that most high-born ladies were not. She flew Vhagar for the joy of it, racing through clouds and diving toward the sea just to feel the rush of speed and danger. She laughed easily, spoke her mind, and gave Daemon something he had never really experienced before in his 36 years. An equal partner. They did not stay on Dragonstone, or in Westeros at all. The weight of politics and exile and scandal was too heavy. The walls of the realm too confining for two people who were both used to doing exactly as they pleased. They left, mounted their dragons, and flew east across the narrow sea to Essos. They became guests of Prince Regio Haratis in Pentos, one of the free cities where Daemon's reputation as a warrior and Laenaean's status as a Targaryen princess ensured them welcome and luxury. Pentos was wealthy, sophisticated, free from the suffocating traditions of Westerosi nobility. Here they could live as they chose, accountable to no one, bound by no expectations beyond what they set for themselves. It was by all accounts the happiest period of Daemon's life. They flew together often, Caraxes and Vhagar, two of the greatest dragons in the world, racing through foreign skies. They explored Essos, visiting Volantis and Tyrosh and other cities that most Westerosi only heard about in stories. They attended festivals and feasts. They loved publicly and without shame. In 118 AC, Laenor gave birth to twin daughters, Laenor and Rhaena, named in the Targaryen tradition, silver-haired and purple-eyed like their parents. Daemon, to the surprise of many who knew him, proved to be a devoted father. He doted on his daughters, taught them to be fearless, promised them dragons of their own when they were old enough to claim them. For 3 years, this strange exile became a kind of paradise. Daemon was free from his brother's court, from Otto Hightower's scheming, from the constant political maneuvering that had defined his entire life. He had a wife he actually loved, daughters who adored him, a dragon, wealth enough for any comfort, and the freedom to live exactly as he chose. Perhaps if things had continued this way, history would have been very different. Perhaps Daemon would have remained in Essos, raised his daughters there, become nothing more than a footnote in Westerosi history, the rogue prince who flew away and never came back. But the gods, or fate, or simple cruel chance, had other plans. In 120 AC, Laenor became pregnant again. She was 27, still young, healthy, and strong. There was no reason to expect complications. The pregnancy progressed normally for months. Daemon began to plan for their growing family, perhaps even considering a return to Westeros now that years had passed and tempers had cooled. Then labor began, and everything went wrong. The baby was positioned badly. The Maester said the birth was not progressing as it should. Hours turned into a day, and Laenor's strength began to fail. The Maesters presented Daemon with the same terrible choice that had been given to his brother Viserys years before. They could cut the baby from her womb, try to save the child, but Laenor would almost certainly die. Or they could let nature take its course and likely lose them both. Daemon, remembering what that choice had cost Viserys, remembering Aemma's screams and the blood and the futility of it all, refused to decide. He would not sentence his wife to death. He would not play at being gods. Whatever happened would happen without his consent to butchery. But Lyanna made her own choice. She knew she was dying. She could feel it in her body, the life draining from her with each hour that passed. She had been a dragon rider since she was 15 years old, had bonded with the greatest dragon in the world, had flown through storms and battles and moments of pure transcendent freedom. She would not die in a bed sweating and screaming, cut open by maesters like livestock. She would die, as a dragon rider should. Lyanna dragged herself from her birthing bed, weak and bleeding, supported by servants who begged her to lie back down. She made her way outside to where Vhagar waited, the great dragon sensing her rider's distress. Daemon ran after her, understanding what she intended, trying to stop her, or join her, or simply be with her in those final moments. Lyanna stood before Vhagar, barely able to remain on her feet. She looked up at the dragon who had been her companion for 12 years, and she gave the command in High Valyrian. Dracarys. Vhagar hesitated. Dragons bond with their riders, love them in whatever way dragons can love, but the command was clear, the rider's will absolute. The flames came, merciful in their speed, if not their nature. Lyanna Velaryon died as she chose, burned by dragon fire, a death worthy of her bloodline and her courage. Daemon stood and watched his wife die, watched the flames consume the woman he loved and the child she carried, watched the life he had built in Essos turn to ash in moments. He was 40 years old, his second wife was dead, his daughters were motherless, and the brief, perfect happiness he had found was over, burned away like everything else he had ever tried to hold on to. There was nothing left in Essos for him now, only memories and ghosts. It was time to go home, back to Westeros, back to Dragonstone, back to the only person who had ever truly understood him. His niece Rhaenyra was waiting. Daemon returned to Dragonstone in 120 AC carrying the ashes of his wife and the weight of grief that would have broken lesser men. His twin daughters Balela and Rhaena, only 2 years old, clung to him as they flew across the narrow sea on Caraxes. They had lost their mother. He had lost the one woman who had made him believe happiness was possible. But Dragonstone was not empty when he arrived. Rhaenyra was there. She had her own reasons for residing on the ancient island fortress rather than at court in King's Landing. Her marriage to Laenor Velaryon had produced 3 sons, Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey, but the realm whispered constantly about their legitimacy. The boys had brown hair and brown eyes, pug noses, and common features. They looked nothing like Laenor or Rhaenyra, both of whom carried the unmistakable Targaryen features. They looked, in fact, remarkably like Sari Harwin Strong, the commander of the City Watch and Rhaenyra's close companion. The whispers were cruel and persistent. Bastards they called the princes, were strong boys, a play on their suspected father's name. Rhaenyra maintained the fiction that they were Lyanna's true-born sons, and Lyanna himself supported this publicly, raising them as his own. But the damage to her reputation was done. The succession that should have been secure was now questioned by many who saw bastards in line for the Iron Throne. Rhaenyra was 23 now, a woman grown, a mother 3 times over, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who expected to rule. She was no longer the teenage girl Daemon had taken into the city 5 years earlier. She had been hardened by marriage, by motherhood, by the constant attacks on her legitimacy and her son's birthright. When Daemon arrived with his daughters, Rhaenyra welcomed them with genuine warmth. She had always been fond of her uncle, and now they were both trapped in their own ways by circumstances and scandal and the weight of expectations neither had asked for. They understood each other in ways few others could. Both were Targaryens who refused to play by rules written by lesser men. Both had been exiled from their father's court. Both carried wounds that would never fully heal. What began as comfort between two lonely people quickly became something more. By late 120 AC, just months after Laena's death, Laena Velaryon died as well. The official story was that he was killed during a visit to Spicetown, murdered by his lover during a jealous quarrel. His body was burned beyond recognition before it could be returned to Driftmark. The timing was suspicious. The circumstances were questionable, and Daemon, who had just become conveniently widowed, was now free to marry again. Years later, rumors would surface that Landor had not died at all, that the body burned at Spicetown belonged to someone else, a servant or a criminal who resembled him enough to pass, that Daemon had arranged the entire thing, allowing Landor to escape across the narrow sea with his lover to live freely in Essos while everyone believed him dead. That Rhaenyra and Daemon had conspired together to free themselves from unwanted marriages without the scandal of divorce or annulment. Whether true or not, the effect was the same. Both were free, both were available, and neither waited long to act on it. Daemon and Rhaenyra married in a Valyrian ceremony on Dragonstone, conducted by a priest in the old traditions of their house. No permission from the king. No grand court wedding, no pretense of waiting a respectful time after their respective spouses' deaths. They simply married, announced it to the realm, and dared anyone to challenge them. The scandal was enormous. Viserys was horrified that his brother and daughter had married without his consent so soon after becoming widowed in a ceremony that many considered barely legitimate. The faith condemned it as incestuous uncle marrying niece, an abomination even by Targaryen standards. The court divided between those who saw it as romantic and those who saw it as calculated political maneuvering. But Viserys was in no position to stop them. His health had been declining for years. The cuts and wounds he sustained seemingly from the Iron Throne itself festered and refused to heal. He had lost fingers, then part of his arm. The Maesters whispered about infection spreading through his body. He was still king, but his power was waning with his health. Daemon and Rhaenyra made Dragonstone their seat of power, and it became clear quickly that this was not just a marriage, but a political alliance. Daemon brought military expertise and ruthless determination. Rhaenyra brought legitimacy and the claim to the throne. Together they were formidable in ways that neither had been alone. In 121 AC, Rhaenyra gave birth to Aegon the Younger, a son who bore unmistakable Targaryen features, silver hair, purple eyes, the look of ancient Valyria. Then in 122 AC came Viserys, another son equally Targaryen in appearance. These boys answered the whispers about Rhaenyra's older sons. She could produce true Targaryen children when the father's blood was right. Daemon proved himself surprisingly capable as a stepfather to Rhaenyra's older boys. He trained Jacaerys and Lucerys in swordplay and strategy, treated them as his own, never once questioned their legitimacy publicly. He was building something on Dragonstone, a power base loyal to Rhaenyra and prepared for the conflict he knew was coming. Because back in King's Landing, Queen Alicent was building her own faction. Her children were growing into their roles. Aegon the Elder, Viserys' eldest son, was being groomed by some to see himself as the true heir. Aebernon had claimed Vagar after Lyanna's death, the largest dragon in the world, now ridden by a prince who believed his older half-sister had stolen his birthright. Aebernon, sweet and strange, had married Aegon as tradition demanded. Valyana was being fostered in Old Town with the Hightowers. The realm was splitting, slowly but inevitably, into two camps. The Blacks, supporting Rhaenyra's claim as the named heir, and the Greens, believing that Aegon the Elder should inherit as the king's eldest son. Every noble house was being forced to choose. Every marriage, every alliance, every decision was made with the coming conflict in mind. Daemon understood this better than anyone. He had spent his entire life watching power shift and change, had fought wars and played politics, and learned that eventually polite words and careful diplomacy gave way to steel and fire. He prepared Dragonstone for war. He cultivated alliances with houses he knew would support Rhaenyra. He trained dragon riders and gathered soldiers. Rhaenyra, for her part, tried to maintain peace as long as her father lived. She loved Viserys despite everything, and she knew that open conflict while he still drew breath would tear him apart. But she also listened to Daemon's counsel, hardened herself for what was coming, and made sure her sons understood that their lives and their futures depended on her successfully claiming the throne. The years from 120 to 129 AC were a countdown. Everyone at court knew it, even if they pretended otherwise. King Viserys was dying by inches, his body failing piece by piece. When he finally passed, the realm would erupt. The question was not if there would be war, but how quickly it would start and how devastating it would be. Daemon and Rhaenyra spent those years building their power, raising their children, and preparing for the moment when everything would change. They flew their dragons together. Caraxes and Syrax, two blood-red serpents in the sky over Dragonstone. They planned strategy and forged alliances. They loved each other with the intensity of people who knew their time might be short and their future uncertain. On Dragonstone, away from the poison of court politics, they built something that resembled a normal life, as normal as life could be for Targaryens preparing for civil war. Daemon's daughters from Lyanna grew alongside Rhaenyra's sons from Lyanna and their own children together. It was a blended family bound by blood and fire, and the knowledge that they would all stand or fall together. In King's Landing, Viserys clung to life and to the hope that his children would honor his wishes after his death, that they would accept Rhaenyra as queen, that the oath sworn years ago would be kept, that love and law would triumph over ambition and tradition. He was wrong, of course, but he died believing it, and perhaps that was a mercy. In 129 AC, King Viserys I passed away in his sleep, his body finally surrendering to the infections that had ravaged it for years, and the moment he drew his last breath, the careful peace that had held for so long shattered completely. The dance of the dragons had begun. King Viserys died in his apartments at the Red Keep, attended by Queen Alicent and a handful of servants. His final words, confused and rambling as the milk of the poppy clouded his mind, would be twisted and interpreted to serve purposes he never intended. But what happened in the hours and days after his death was not confusion or misinterpretation. It was conspiracy, executed with precision. The small council, dominated by Alicent's supporters and led by her father Otto Hightower, who had been reinstated as Hand years earlier, moved immediately. They sealed the Red Keep. No ravens were allowed to leave. No one was permitted to enter or exit. The king's death was kept secret from everyone except those who needed to know to execute the plan that had been prepared for years. Within hours they crowned Aegon the Elder as King Aegon II, not in a grand public ceremony with all the realm watching, but in a rushed coronation in the Dragon Pit with only select nobles present. Sir Criston Cole, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and a man who had grown to despise Rhaenyra for personal reasons, lost to history, placed the crown of Aegon the Conqueror on the young king's head. Aegon himself was reluctant. By most accounts, he knew his father had named Rhaenyra heir. He knew the lords had sworn oaths to her, but his mother and grandfather convinced him that his life and his siblings' lives depended on taking the throne, that Rhaenyra and Daemon would kill them all to secure the succession, that he had no choice but to accept or die. The crowd that witnessed the coronation cheered. The small folk of King's Landing had no great love for Rhaenyra, who had spent years away from the capital, but they knew Aegon, who had lived among them. The Greens presented it as the will of the people supporting the natural order of succession. Meanwhile, on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra knew nothing. The ravens that should have brought news of her father's death never arrived. Days passed in ignorance while the Greens consolidated their position and secured their allies. When Rhaenyra finally learned the truth, it came not from official channels but from a ship captain who had been in King's Landing during the coronation and sailed to Dragonstone with the news. Her father was dead. Her throne had been stolen. Her half-brother wore her crown. The shock and grief hit her simultaneously. She had loved her father despite his flaws, despite his weakness in not preparing better for this moment. And now he was gone. And she had not been there, had not been able to say goodbye, had not even known he was dying. The betrayal compounded the loss. Alicent had kept his death secret deliberately, giving the Greens time to act before Rhaenyra could respond. The stress and grief triggered premature labor. Rhaenyra gave birth far too early to a daughter she named Visenya, after one of the Conqueror's sister wives. The baby was malformed, stillborn, a twisted thing that seemed almost monstrous. Some saw it as an evil omen. Rhaenyra saw it as another loss in a day of unbearable losses. Her father dead, her throne stolen, her daughter dead. Everything she had been promised torn away in hours. Daemon found her in her chambers, devastated and bleeding, holding the body of her stillborn daughter. Whatever softness he might have developed over the years in Essos vanished in that moment. This was war now, not the polite fiction of competing claims to be decided by law and precedent, but actual war with steel and fire and blood. He sent for the lords and allies who had gathered on Dragonstone, those who had remained loyal to Rhaenyra's cause. The Black Council convened in the Painted Table Room, where Aegon the Conqueror had once planned his invasion of Westeros. It was fitting. They were planning their own conquest now, taking back what had been stolen. Lord Corlys Velaryon was there, ancient and still powerful, commanding the largest fleet in Westeros. His loyalty had wavered over the years, his relationship with Daemon complicated by old grievances and competing ambitions, but he supported Rhaenyra's claim. His wife Rhaenys, the queen who never was, who had herself been denied the throne years earlier, stood with them as well. She understood better than anyone what it meant to have your birthright stolen by men who believed themselves more deserving simply for being born male. Rhaenyra's sons were present. Jaehaerys, the eldest at 14, already showing the leadership and courage that would define his brief life. Jaehaerys, younger and more uncertain but loyal. Even little Joffrey, too young to fully understand but old enough to know his mother had been wronged. Daemon's daughters Baela and Rhaena were there, though they would play smaller roles in what was to come, and throughout the castle, dragon riders prepared their mounts. Dragonstone had always been the seat of Targaryen power, the place where dragon eggs hatched and dragon riders trained. Now it would be the seat of war. Daemon stood before the council and laid out the situation with brutal clarity. The Greens held King's Landing and the Iron Throne. They had the legitimacy that came from possession and the support of houses that believed in male primogeniture. They had secured the Kingsguard and the City Watch. They had dragons of their own, including Vhagar, the largest in the world, now ridden by Aemond. But the Blacks had advantages too. The North would support them, honor bound by oaths sworn to Rhaenyra years ago. The Vale would follow, led by Lady Jane Arryn, Rhaenyra's cousin. The Riverlands could be secured through alliances and shows of force. And they had dragons, multiple dragons, with experienced riders. The debate began over strategy. Some counseled caution, seeking to negotiate, to find a peaceful settlement that would avoid open war. Rhaenyra, still weak from her ordeal, initially favored this approach. She did not want to be responsible for tearing the realm apart, for killing her own kin, for burning the kingdom her father had tried so hard to keep peaceful. Daemon had no such hesitations. He argued for immediate decisive action, fly to King's Landing with all their dragons. he said. Burn the Red Keep if necessary. Kill Aegon and Otto Hightower, and anyone else who stood in their way. Take the throne by force and deal with the consequences later. Rhaenyra restrained him. There would be war. She accepted that now, but it would be conducted with some attempt at honor and legitimacy. They would call their banners. They would give houses the chance to honor their oaths. They would fight for her crown, but they would try to minimize the destruction where possible. It was decided to send envoys. Jaehaerys would fly to the Vale and then to the north, securing their most crucial allies. Lucerys would go to Storm's End to treat with Lord Boros Baratheon and secure the Stormlands. Other messengers would go by ship and horse to the Riverlands and the Reach. Ravens flew from Dragonstone carrying Rhaenyra's declaration, naming the Greens as usurpers and traitors, calling on the realm to honor the oath sworn to her. The realm divided almost immediately. Some houses declared for Rhaenyra, honoring their oaths or believing in her cause. Others declared for Aegon, either from genuine belief in male succession or calculated political advantage. Many tried to stay neutral, knowing that choosing wrong could mean extinction. The tension built for days as messengers flew and lords made their choices, and then came the news that changed everything, that made war not just inevitable but personal. Lucerys had flown to Storm's End on his young dragon, Arax. He delivered Rhaenyra's message to Lord Boros Baratheon, asking for his support. But Daemon Targaryen was already there, riding Vhagar, having arrived first with offers from Aegon. The two princes, first cousins, met in Boros's hall. Daemon demanded Luke apologize for an old injury, an eye he had lost years ago in a childhood fight. Luke refused and was allowed to leave. But Aemon followed him, up into the storming sky above Shipbreaker Bay, Vhagar pursuing the much smaller Arax. What happened next was debated, whether Aemon meant to kill Luke or only frighten him, whether the dragons acted on their own or followed their rider's commands. The result was not debatable. Vhagar, massive and ancient and terrible, caught Arax in her jaws mid-flight and tore the smaller dragon apart. Lucerys Velaryon, 14 years old, fell screaming into the sea. His body was never recovered. The news reached Dragonstone like a thunderbolt. Rhaenyra's son, her sweet boy, murdered by her half-brother, not in battle, but in what should have been a diplomatic mission, protected by the traditional immunity of envoys. Daemon found Rhaenyra in her chambers, staring out at the sea that had swallowed her son. She was beyond grief now, in that cold place where loss becomes rage, becomes determination. She looked at her uncle and husband, and spoke words that would echo through history. "A son for a son," she said. Daemon nodded. He understood perfectly. The Greens had taken her son, murdered him in cold blood. The debt would be paid in kind. Whatever restraint Rhaenyra had counseled before, whatever mercy she had considered, died with Luke in the waters off Storm's End. The dance of the dragons was no longer about crowns and thrones and legitimacy. It was blood feud now, personal, unforgivable. And Daemon knew exactly how to collect what was owed. In the black heart of grief, men become capable of monstrous things. Daemon Targaryen, who had always walked the line between hero and villain, crossed it completely in the winter of 129 AC. He did not tell Rhaenyra the specifics of what he planned. Perhaps he knew she would stop him, or perhaps he simply understood that some acts were best done without explicit approval, allowing her the thin protection of plausible deniability. He reached out through old contacts in King's Landing, men who had served under him when he commanded the City Watch, who still remembered the rogue prince and owed him loyalty or feared him enough to comply. 2 men were hired for the task. One was called Blood, a former sergeant in the Gold Cloaks who had been dismissed for brutality even by their standards. The other was called Cheese, a rat catcher who worked in the bowels of the Red Keep and knew every secret passage, every hidden corridor that wound through the ancient castle like veins through a body. Their instructions were clear. Infiltrate the Red Keep. Find Prince Aemond. Kill him. A son for a son. Justice for Lucerys, delivered in the most direct way possible. But plans made in anger rarely survive contact with reality. Blood and Cheese entered the Red Keep through the passages Cheese used daily in his work, places where servants moved unseen, where the guards never thought to look. They searched for Aemond through the night, moving carefully, avoiding detection. But Aemond was not in his chambers. He was not in the parts of the castle they could access. They could not find him. Time was running out. Dawn approached. Soon the castle would wake fully, and their opportunity would vanish. They had been paid to kill a son of King Aegon. Daemon's gold weighed heavy in their purses. They needed to deliver something or face his wrath when they failed. They found themselves in the quarters belonging to Queen Helena, Aegon's wife and sister. Helena had always been strange, prone to prophetic dreams and odd statements that made more sense in hindsight than in the moment. She was there with her children, 2 boys and a girl, Jaehaerys, 6 years old, and Aegon's heir, Jaehaerys, his twin sister, and little Mael, just 2. Blood and Cheese entered the room with daggers drawn. Helena, realizing immediately what they were, tried to bargain. She offered them gold, jewels, anything they wanted. They refused. They had a job to do, a son to kill. But which son? What happened next was cruelty beyond comprehension, even in an age that had seen its share of atrocities. They gave Helena a choice. She had 3 children. They would kill one. She had to choose which one would die, or they would kill all 3. Helena, trapped in a nightmare made real, made the only choice a mother could make in such an impossible situation. She offered herself instead. They refused. She begged them to take her life and spare all her children. They refused. Finally, breaking under pressure no human should endure, she whispered a name, Myrcella, the youngest. Perhaps thinking that the older children had more life lived, more memories made. Perhaps simply choosing randomly in a moment of complete horror. Blood and Cheese smiled at her choice. Then they killed Jaehaerys instead. They held the 6-year-old boy down. While his mother screamed and his siblings cried, they sawed through his neck with a dagger, not cleanly or quickly, but with deliberate cruelty, making sure Helena watched every moment. They took the child's head as proof of their work and fled through the same passages that had brought them in, disappearing into the warrens of King's Landing before the alarm could be raised. When King Aegon learned what had happened to his son, his heir, he went mad with grief and rage. The city was locked down, every exit sealed. Thousands were arrested, interrogated, tortured for information. Blood was caught within hours, recognized by former comrades in the gold cloaks. He was questioned extensively and brutally before being executed. Cheese was found days later, hiding in the depths of Flea Bottom. He suffered far worse before he died. But no amount of torture or execution could undo what had been done. The Greens had their own murdered child now, their own grievance that demanded blood payment. Queen Helena, who had always been fragile, broke completely. She would never truly recover from having to watch her son murdered because of her choice, haunted by the knowledge that she had named one child and they had killed the other, making her guilt more complex and terrible. The realm reacted with horror. Even those who supported Rhaenyra's claim were sickened by the murder of a child in his own home. It was one thing to kill soldiers in battle, even to kill princes who took up arms. It was another entirely to send assassins after children, to terrorize a mother with impossible choices, to saw through a 6-year-old's neck while he cried for mercy. Daemon never admitted to ordering the killing of Jaehaerys specifically. He maintained when pressed that his orders had been to kill Aemond, a warrior prince who had murdered Lucerys, that blood and cheese had exceeded their instructions, made their own cruel choices in the moment. Whether this was truth or convenient fiction, only Daemon knew. Rhaenyra's public response was carefully calculated. She expressed regret for the death of her nephew, while maintaining that the Greens had brought this on themselves by murdering her son. She did not disavow Daemon's actions, which many took as tacit approval. The message was clear. The Blacks would not restrain themselves anymore. This was total war now, with all the horror that implied. The incident poisoned any possibility of negotiated peace. Both sides dug in, committed to total victory because anything less would mean their own children remained in danger. Houses that had tried to stay neutral were forced to choose, knowing that neutrality would be seen as cowardice or complicity by whichever side eventually won. Daemon, for his part, moved immediately to military action. While the Greens reeled from blood and cheese, he gathered forces and launched a campaign into the Riverlands. The Riverlands were strategically crucial, the heartland of Westeros, controlling the major roads and river systems that armies needed to move. Secure the Riverlands, and you could cut the realm in half, preventing the Greens from moving forces between their territories. Daemon flew to Harrenhal on Caraxes, and took the massive ruined castle with barely a fight. Harrenhal had been cursed since Aegon the Conqueror's dragons burned it during the original invasion. Every house that had held it since had come to bad ends, but Daemon was undeterred by curses or history. He made Harrenhal his seat of operations, using it as a base to subjugate the Riverlands. His methods were brutal and effective. Lords who declared for Aegon had their castles burned and their families taken hostage. Those who bent the knee to Rhaenyra were spared, but forced to contribute men and supplies to the war effort. Daemon moved quickly and decisively, always with Caraxes at hand, to emphasize that resistance was not just futile, but suicidal. Within weeks, the Riverlands were largely secured for the Blacks. It was a significant strategic victory, accomplished through a combination of terror and competence. Daemon proved himself as capable a military commander on land as he had been in the Stepstones, using speed and dragonfire to compensate for limited numbers. But Harrenhal itself began to affect him in strange ways. The castle was genuinely cursed, or haunted, or simply so soaked in blood and tragedy that it infected the minds of those who dwelled within it. Daemon began having dreams, visions, moments where reality seemed to shift and blur. He encountered Alice Rivers, a bastard woman who served in the castle and who claimed to have prophetic abilities. What passed between Daemon and Alice Rivers became the subject of endless speculation. Some said she was a witch who seduced him, that he took her as a lover while his wife fought for her crown elsewhere. Others claimed she fed him potions and visions, that she manipulated him for her own purposes. Still others insisted she was simply a wise woman who understood the horror unfolding and tried in her own way to influence events toward less catastrophic outcomes. Whatever the truth, Daemon remained at Harrenhal through much of 129 AC, holding the Riverlands while other battles raged across Westeros. Rhaenyra's forces won some and lost others. Dragons died on both sides, ancient beasts brought down by scorpion bolts or torn apart by other dragons. The dance lived up to its name as dragons danced in the sky, locked in mortal combat, burning the world below. The war that had started with the murder of Luke and escalated with the murder of Jaehaerys consumed the realm completely. There was no mercy anymore. No possibility of half measures. The Targaryens were destroying themselves and taking Westeros down with them. And Daemon, sitting in cursed Harrenhal, knew that it could only end one way, with more death, more fire, more blood. The question was whose? The war ground on through 129 and into 130 AC, consuming lives and dragons with terrible efficiency. Both sides had lost so much already that victory had become less about winning and more about ensuring the other side lost everything too. The original causes, the questions of legitimacy and succession, had been buried under layers of grief and vengeance until only hate remained. Daemon Targaryen had become the Green's most effective weapon. Mounted on Vhagar, the largest dragon in the world, he terrorized the Riverlands with calculated brutality. He burned castles that supported the Blacks, put entire villages to the torch, made examples of anyone who dared oppose King Aegon's claim. His tactics were designed to break the will of Rhaenyra's supporters, to make them understand that loyalty to the Black Queen meant death by dragonfire. But Aemond made a critical mistake. He became predictable in his cruelty. Every few days he would mount Vhagar and fly out from whatever stronghold he occupied, searching for targets, burning and killing, before returning to rest. His pattern was noticed by scouts and spies. Information was gathered, analyzed, passed along through networks of ravens and riders. The information reached Harrenhal. It reached Daemon. Daemon understood immediately what needed to happen. Aemond had to die, not just because of Lucerys, though that debt remained unpaid despite blood and cheese. Not just because Vhagar represented the Green's greatest military asset, a dragon so massive that few others could challenge her, but because Aemond himself had become a symbol, a rallying point for the Green forces. Kill him, and you broke something in the enemy's morale that could never be repaired. More than that, Daemon recognized something of himself in his nephew. The same recklessness, the same appetite for violence, the same absolute certainty in his own abilities. They were both kinslayers now, both men who had crossed lines that should never be crossed. In another life, they might have been allies, brothers in spirit if not blood. In this life, only one of them could survive. Daemon made his preparations carefully. He wrote letters to Rhaenyra, though what he said in them was never revealed. Some historians believe they were love letters, final words from a husband who knew he might not return. Others think they were strategic, laying out plans for continuing the war if he fell. Perhaps they were both. Perhaps they were neither. He spent time with Alyce Rivers, the mysterious woman who had become his companion at Harrenhal. What she told him, what visions she shared, what prophecies she spoke, died with them. But Daemon emerged from those final conversations with a calm certainty that some interpreted as acceptance and others as resignation. He flew caraxes in circles above Harrenhal, testing the dragon's responses, ensuring that rider and mount were perfectly synchronized. Caraxes was older now, scarred from multiple battles, but still fierce and loyal. They had been together for decades, fought together in the Stepstones, flown together across half the world. If this was to be their last flight, they would make it count. The day came when scouts reported Aemond flying north from Harrenhal's vicinity, burning villages loyal to the Blacks. Daemon mounted caraxes and took to the sky. He flew low initially, using the terrain and cloud cover to hide his approach. This was not a formal duel with announcements and ceremony. This was an ambush, a hunt, and Daemon was patient enough to let his prey come to him. The encounter happened above the God's Eye, the vast lake that bordered Harrenhal. The lake had its own dark reputation, said to be haunted, its depths hiding secrets from the Age of Heroes. The waters were still and black, reflecting the sky like a mirror. It was here, above cursed water beside a cursed castle, that the two kinslayers would meet. Aemond saw caraxes rising from the lake's mist, too late to avoid engagement. Perhaps he welcomed it. He had Vhagar, after all, the dragon that had conquered Westeros alongside Aegon. What did he have to fear from an aging prince on a smaller dragon? He learned the answer quickly. Caraxes was not as large as Vhagar, but he was faster, more agile, and far more experienced in combat. Daemon had fought dragon battles before, in the Stepstones, in smaller skirmishes during this war. He understood aerial combat in ways that Aemond, for all his cruelty and confidence, did not. The two dragons collided above the god's eye in a tangle of wings and flame, Caraxes serpentine and flexible, wrapped around Vhagar's massive bulk, claws tearing at scales, jaws seeking the larger dragon's throat. Vhagar tried to use her size advantage to crush or throw off the smaller dragon, but Caraxes held on with desperate strength. Fire erupted from both dragons, turning the air itself into an inferno. They spun and fell, locked together, plummeting toward the lake below. Neither rider could control their mount anymore. The dragons were fighting on instinct now, each trying to kill the other, both willing to die if it meant taking their enemy with them. Daemon made his decision in the seconds before impact. He could die strapped to Caraxes when they hit the water, drowned or crushed. Or he could take one last chance, one final desperate gamble. He unbuckled himself from his saddle, drew Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel sword he had carried his entire adult life, and as the dragons fell spinning toward the god's eye, Daemon Targaryen leaped. For a moment, he flew, not on dragonback, but alone, falling through smoke and heat, sword in hand. He landed on Vhagar's massive back, somehow keeping his balance on the dragon's scales despite the chaos. Aemond, strapped in his saddle, turned too late to defend himself. Daemon drove Dark Sister through his nephew's remaining eye, through his skull, killing him instantly. The blade went in so deep that Daemon could not pull it free. And then they hit the water. The impact was catastrophic. Both dragons, both riders, all of it disappeared beneath the black surface of the god's eye in an explosion of water and blood and steam from their dying fire. The lake swallowed them completely, and when the waters finally calmed, there was nothing. No bodies, no dragons, no survivors. Fishermen on the lake's shores reported seeing the battle, told stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed they saw Daemon's ghost rise from the water, still gripping Dark Sister. Others said the dragons lived still, locked together at the bottom of the lake, sleeping until some future day when they would rise again. Most simply marked the spot where they had fallen and avoided it afterward, understanding that some places were too soaked in death to ever be safe. News of the battle reached both sides within days. For the Greens, it was devastating. Aemond had been their champion, their most effective warrior. Vhagar, the symbol of their power, was gone. The loss broke something in Aegon, already fragile from grief over his murdered son, now mourning his brother as well. For the Blacks, it was bittersweet victory. They had lost Daemon, Rhaenyra's husband and strongest supporter, her military strategist and dragon rider. But they had also eliminated the enemy's greatest threat. The strategic calculus of the war shifted dramatically. Without Vhagar, without Aemond, the Greens were far more vulnerable. Rhaenyra grieved for Daemon in ways she had not grieved for anyone else, not even her father. He had understood her in ways no one else ever had. He had supported her claim when others wavered, had loved her without shame, had been willing to do terrible things so she would not have to. Whatever his flaws, and they were many, his loyalty to her had been absolute. The war continued for months after the battle above the god's eye, but the outcome was increasingly inevitable. The Blacks pressed their advantages. The Greens made desperate gambles that failed. Dragons continued to die, until barely any remained. Eventually, King Aegon himself was poisoned by his own counselors, men who saw that continuing the war would destroy what little remained of the realm. Rhaenyra briefly held King's Landing, but her reign was short and tragic. The small folk, exhausted by war and resentful of the taxes required to fund it, turned against her. She fled the city, was betrayed by former allies, and eventually was fed to Aegon's dragon Sunfire by her surviving half-brother. She died as she had lived, consumed by the very forces she had tried to control. In the end, it was Rhaenyra's son, Aegon the Younger, Daemon's own child, who inherited the throne. Aegon III. They called him the Dragonbane, the Broken King. He had watched his mother die, had seen every dragon fall during the war, had grown up in a world of constant death and betrayal. His reign brought peace, but it was the peace of exhaustion, of a realm so broken that it had no strength left to fight. The Dance of the Dragons destroyed House Targaryen's greatest advantage. The dragons died, all of them, the last eggs refusing to hatch, as if the species itself understood it had no place in the world anymore. The Targaryens would continue to rule for another century and a half, but they would never again have the power they once possessed. They had burned it all away fighting each other. And Daemon Targaryen, who died at 49 years old in the waters of the God's Eye, became legend. Not quite hero, not quite villain, but something more complicated and more human than either. A man of extraordinary ability and terrible faults. A prince who conquered kingdoms and destroyed the one he was born into. A husband and father who loved fiercely and killed without mercy. A warrior whose greatest victory was also his death. History has never decided what to make of Daemon Targaryen. The maesters who chronicle the dance write of him with a mixture of admiration and horror. Some paint him as Rhaenyra's evil counselor, the voice that pushed her toward war and atrocity. Others see him as a tragic figure, a man shaped by a world that rewarded violence and punished vulnerability, who did what he thought necessary to protect those he loved. Perhaps the truth is that Daemon was simply himself, purely and without apology. He never pretended to be better than he was. He embraced his nature, both the noble and the monstrous parts, and he lived according to his own code, even when that code led him to commit unforgivable acts. His legacy lived on through his children. Baela and Rhaenyra, his daughters with Levina, survived the war and married well, continuing the Targaryen bloodline. Aegon III, his son with Rhaenyra, ruled as king. Viserys II, his other son, was eventually found alive after being thought dead and also became king later. The Targaryen dynasty continued through Daemon's blood, which perhaps would have pleased him more than any monument or song. Dark Sister, his Valyrian steel sword, was lost with him in the God's Eye. It has never been recovered despite numerous attempts over the centuries. Perhaps it lies still at the bottom of that cursed lake, gripped in the skeletal hand of a prince who refused to let go even in death. Perhaps it was taken by scavengers or washed out to sea, or perhaps, as some romantic stories claim, it waits for another Targaryen worthy to wield it, another warrior who will take up the blade and continue the legacy of fire and blood. The Rogue Prince, the King of the Narrow Sea, the Lord of Harrenhal, the Kinslayer who died killing Kinnan. Daemon Targaryen defied everyone, broke every rule, lived exactly as he chose, and died in a moment of terrible glory that artists and singers would remember for generations. He was everything House Targaryen was at its best and its worst, magnificent and terrible, capable of great love and greater violence, bound by loyalty and driven by ambition. A man who could have been anything but chose to be exactly himself and let the realm burn if it could not accept him as he was. That, in the end, is the story of Daemon Targaryen. Not a hero, not a villain, just a man who rode a dragon, loved a queen, and fell from the sky locked in combat with his own nephew, while the world watched and wondered and feared what would come next. The dance ended. The dragons died, but the legend lived on. And somewhere, deep in the black waters of the God's Eye, the bloodworm and the ancient queen of dragons sleep their final sleep, still locked together as they were in that last desperate moment before the water claimed them all.